Hi, everyone. So today we'll be talking about building applications that leverage Airflow's migration framework. My name is Ephraim Anierobi. I'm a senior software engineer and astronomer, committer and PMC member of Apache Airflow. We'll start with the Airflow database. The backbone of Airflow database is the SQL Alchemy, which is used for ORM models, and the Alembic, which is used for migrations. Airflow supports Postgres and MySQL for production and SQLite for dev or test. When we talk about Airflow DB migration, we use Alembic, like I mentioned, and you can see the migration directory in Airflow/migrations, and all the revisions under the versions in the migrations directory, which Alembic creates. And we use the Alembic version table for tracking of the current revision. And we also have some commands in Airflow for migrating or doing a downgrade or checking migrations. Airflow DB check migrations is one command that waits for migrations to be done, checking if your migrations are done for your Airflow deployment. So in Airflow 2, the problem we have was that when you run Airflow DB command, it will not run your migrations that you define outside the core Airflow migration. So all it does is run Airflow core migration. Or if you have a table in provider or plugins, it will not be able to run those migrations. And the implication is that when you want to start, if you are using Airflow chart to start up your Airflow components, we usually wait for migrations to be done before we can start up the scheduler or DAG processor. And if we are running the command to check that migrations are done, it will not run your app's migration. So that is the major problem we have in Airflow 2. Then in Airflow 3, we now added what we call DB Manager. And the purpose is so that we can be able to run your own migration and for Airflow to also be able to wait for your migrations to be done. So in Airflow 3, if you run Airflow DB migrate or check migrations, it will run core Airflow migrations. If you register a DB manager, it's going to run migration for your plugin. If you have any migration in your plugin, to run it for you. And when we also run DB check migrations, it will also check your app's migration on whether it is done or not. And today I'm going to teach you about this, how to link the DB manager, how to implement a DB manager and connect it to your Airflow deployment so that you'll be able to run DB migrate command for the plugins, check migrations, and we also have some commands for managing your external DBs. Well, if you those in the same Airflow tray, if you don't have the DB manager registered for your app, you will not have these migrations like DB check. Both of them will not work for your application. So, but when do we add a DB manager? So you only add a DB manager if you want your table, you define a table in your app. So if you have an application, maybe a plugin that has some tables, and you want the tables to be inside the Airflow metadata database, then you need to define a DB manager. Another reason why you want to define a DB manager is you want, whenever Airflow is waiting for migrations to be done before running the DAG processor or the scheduler or the API server, you want them to also wait for your own app's migration before they can start. But you don't need it if you define your table outside of Airflow database or you have it somewhere else that is not Airflow's metadata database. So the rule there is if you define a table and you want the table to be inside your Airflow database, then you need a DB manager. But if you don't have something like that, you have to skip it. So how do we integrate plugins migration to Airflow? So for this talk, I created this app to show us how and why we need this integration. So it's a simple app that creates ticket for you when a DAG fails and record the ticket in the DB. So because of that, that is why we need a custom DB manager. So you can scan it and can access the code while we go through this talk. So the first step is to initialize Alembic. And when you do that, it's advisable to use the migrations directory. This is just to be in the same page with Airflow, because Airflow uses migrations directory for all migrations. So when you run Airflow any migrations, you will get some of this generated for you. You can see the migration directory and the Alembic.ini file. Now, the first step is to replace the Alembic.ini file with Airflow's ini file, which you can find in Airflow/Alembic.ini file. So the reason we do this is for two things. We want to take advantage of Airflow's configuration for the URL. We also want to take advantage of Airflow login configuration. And the next step is to create a placeholder migration. So you run this command and you create a placeholder migration, something like this. So you know the revision ID because we are going to use it later. And if you are following the app, the part at the top is the part of where we defined all this, whatever I'm showing on the screen. So defining the models, which is the first thing we need to do, we have to use Airflow schema, and we get it from configuration. After that, we also need to use the naming convention that Airflow uses so that everything will work out for us. So you generate the base, which you now use to define your models. Now, for the custom DB manager, we have the base DB manager, which you need to subclass. And when you subclass it, you have to implement the attributes. And this attribute is one thing I'll also talk about each of them: metadata, version table, and the rest of them. You also need to override the upgrade DB. But that is if you want to change anything from the upgrade DB. But what we have is very sufficient. Then the downgrade is where you have to implement, because we don't have it in base DB manager. Now, use the base metadata of the custom DB manager. So this is necessary so that we know where we are creating the tables in. Another thing is to make sure that you are using a unique table name for the version table where we will track the migration. And you now need to set this attribute, support table dropping, which tells the DB manager whether you want to drop your tables whenever we are dropping Airflow DB tables. So when we run Airflow DB reset, if you want your table to also be dropped, then you have to set this to true. Then you also need to set the revision heads map for the DB manager. And what you see here is version versus the revision head. And this is what we are going to use to stamp the migration when we run migration for your app. So you need to copy the revision we generated from the placeholder migration and use it here so that we'll stamp it when we run the migration for your app. And the next step is linking the DB manager to the Alembic migrations. And the way we do it is we edit the env file in migrations directory, importing the DB, the custom DB manager that we created, and setting the version table name and the target metadata. We also define this function which tells the Alembic that we only want the tables in the target metadata to be created. Anything outside of it will not be created. Then in the online and offline migration functions inside the env.py files, you also need to now set these values that we have said before, which is target metadata, version table name, and the include objects. And with those things that we have done, we're actually done with everything, but we need to also make sure that logins are working. So to do that, we need to change this line to this, which basically checks only set this if we don't have any handlers, and make sure that we don't disable existing handlers. So if you did everything right, you have these directories and files, the exception of the listener and services, which is just what I had in the mock application for this talk. Now, the next step is linking the DB manager to Airflow. And the way we do that is by going to the database section of your configuration and adding the custom DB manager to external DB managers. So you can have as many as you want, as many as you want for the DB manager. If you have more than 2 DB managers, you can just add them to this place. So in summary, if you want Airflow to run your migrations, what you need to do is to make sure that the Alembic, you initialize Alembic in your project, implemented the custom DB manager, and configure the DB manager to Airflow. Or you don't need all of this if you don't have any table in your plugin or provider. So what possibilities does this unlock for us? So what this means is that if you have custom DB defined and configured to Airflow, then when you run Airflow DB check migrations, it will also wait for your app migration to be done before running that processor, scheduler, or any other component. And also, when you run Airflow DB migrate, it will also run your apps migration. But the downgrade doesn't run your apps downgrade because we don't know where you want to downgrade to. So because of that, we have DB manager commands for managing your apps migration. So once you have configured the DB manager, you have this Airflow DB manager command, which has all these downgrade, migrate, and reset. And you can trigger them by Airflow DB manager migrate, the part to where you have the custom DB manager. You set version if you want, and it will run your apps migration. We also have the downgrade. You also have to set the version you want to downgrade to. Then we also have the DB reset, which will drop all your tables. And you can decide to skip initialization, just the way you do it in Airflow. Another implementation that uses this method is file provider in Airflow. So you can check it out to know how to configure this for providers.